Right, to start with, we have the nervous system. Now, the nervous system is comprised of the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is made up of the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system is made up of the body that exists outside the central nervous system, so your arms and your legs, as well as the automatic and the somatic nervous system. The automatic nervous system controls the involuntary actions of our organs and glands and participates in emotion. Whereas the somatic nervous system is part of the automatic nervous system that controls our flight or fight response system. The somatic nervous system carries messages from the CNS to the body to control movement, like kicking a ball, catching a ball, riding. And the parasympathetic nervous system is part of the autonomic nervous system that controls our rest and digest. Within our nervous system, we have something called neurons. So these things are neurons. Neurons are cells specialized for communication. They consist of dendrites, the cell body, the axon, myelin sheath, and axon terminals. Now, dendrites receive the information coming from other neurons or the brain. Then the cell body tells the neuron what to do with the information or the electrochemical message, transmitting it down the body and then out the axon terminals to do its job. Now, the myelin sheath is designed to insulate and protect the axon and the message being sent. Now, there are 3 different types of neurons. The first are sensory neurons, which actually carry information away from your limbs towards your brain or your spinal cord. The second one is motor neurons, which does the opposite. They carry information from your brain or your spinal cord towards your limbs to control movement. And thirdly, we have interneurons, which connect sensory and motor neurons together. Now, at the end of neurons, we have something called neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are chemical messengers specialized for communication and released at the axon terminals and then picked up by other neurons. The synapse is the junction between the 2 connecting neurons where the message is actually communicated to each other. And the synaptic cleft is the space between the 2 neurons where the neurotransmitters are released. Now, you've probably heard the word neurotransmitter before. Examples include endorphins, dopamine, and oxytocin. Moving away from the neuron and back up to the brain, we have different parts of the brain that is important to know. The first part is the cerebral cortex. This is the outermost part of the forebrain, which is responsible for sensory and motor processing and higher functioning of your brain. The forebrain is the forward part, so towards the front of your brain, that allows advanced representational and control abilities, also known as the cerebrum. Your brain is made up of 2 halves or 2 hemispheres. You have the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, and they are connected by a band called the corpus callosum. Each side of the brain serve very specialized and important parts and important functions. The frontal lobe is the forwardmost part of the cerebral cortex, responsible for motor control, speech, retrieval of memories, and planning. And the motor cortex is part of the frontal lobe, responsible for body movement. Now, the next one you've probably heard a lot about, the prefrontal cortex. This is also part of your frontal lobe and is responsible for higher order thinking, planning, and language. And most often, we joke about how men or boys develop their prefrontal cortex a lot later than females, which scientifically they do, which is why boys tend to do silly things later on in their life than girls, because their prefrontal cortex is yet to develop fully. Next, we have Broca's area in our frontal lobe. This is the language area in the prefrontal cortex that helps control speech production. Then we have the parietal lobe at the back towards the top of the cerebral cortex and is specialized for touch and spatial awareness. Then you have your temporal lobe, which is located on the sides of your brain and plays a role in hearing and understanding language and memory. Wernicke's area is in the temporal lobe and is involved in the understanding of speech. Finally, we have the occipital lobe, which is towards the back of your brain and is responsible for vision. The primary sensory cortex is the region of the cerebral cortex that initially processes information from the sensory receptors. Then we have the hypothalamus, which you've probably heard a lot about, and is responsible for maintaining the internal state of your brain. Then we have the cerebellum, which is a small cerebrum in the hindbrain, responsible for our sense of balance. The midbrain is part of the brain that contributes to movement and tracking of visual stimuli and reflexes triggered by sound. Then we have the hindbrain, which is part of the brain between the spinal cord and the midbrain, consisting of the pons, cerebellum, and the medulla. Moving on to the famous case studies and theorists in biological psychology, we have the first one, which is Phineas Gage. Now, you've probably heard of this one before, but if you haven't, let me explain it to you. Phineas Gage was just your normal worker who worked on railway lines. And one day when he was working with high acidic chemicals on the railway, he accidentally sparked an explosion. And the rod that he was hammering the railway chemicals with exploded up into his brain through his left eye socket and up, piercing and out the other side his brain. So it looked something like this. So Phineas Gage now had a rod that had pierced through his brain. Went to the hospital and luckily he survived and they removed the brain. They removed the rod. But then they found something very, very interesting. They found that this case had damaged the frontal lobe, so the frontal lobe of his brain over here. And his personality was severely affected. And he went from a very polite, hardworking man to a very impulsive and moody man. So this case study found that when your frontal lobe is actually interfered, it affects your personality and your behavior, which supports the functions of the frontal lobe. Now, moving on from Phineas Gage, we move on to someone called Roger Sperry. Now, Roger Sperry found the brain's hemispheres are each specialized in different but intertwining things. The left hemisphere of your brain actually controls the right side of your body, and the right hemisphere of your brain controls the left side of your body. Now we are going to move on to the different types of devices we can use to analyze the brain. The first one is the ECG, or the electroencephalograph. This is a device that measures the brain's electrical activity at the surface of your scalp, just above your brain. Then we have the CT scan, or the computed tomography, which is a scanning technique that uses multiple X-rays to construct a 3D image. Next, we have an MRI, which is the most common used technique, which uses magnetic fields to indirectly visualize the brain structure. And finally, we have the fMRI, or the functional MRI. And this technique uses magnetic fields to visualize changes in the blood oxygen level due to the brain activity. And there we have it. We've covered everything in the Year 11 ATAR Biological Psychology section. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time.